I've just pressed the button. Hello, we should all be there now. We had a minor technicality in that the internet failed in Canada. So you should all be there watching now, which is nice. I think you're all there. Yep. Just checking. It's delaying at my end now. Yeah. I think you're all still there. Good. So I'm Paul Woodadge, it's World War II TV, and we're going to talk about signals tonight. And we advertised this as a show about signals in World War II, and we will indeed talk about signals in World War II. We're actually going to start there and then go right the way back to the beginning and start 3,000 years ago and build it right the way up to World War II again. So joining me tonight, a little bit later than expected, are two members of the Vintage Signals team in Canada. Hello, Ken. Hello, Terri. Was that a bit stressful waiting?
Oh, what joy, oh bliss.
Well, as I said, the irony of a signals show having a signals failure has not been lost on our audience. It is one of those things, you know, we will overcome. So, yeah, so you're over there in the other side of the Atlantic in Canada. So explain just briefly before we start about the show, what the Vintage Signals team is and what it is you get up to over there.
Right, we show people and teach people about the history of signals because everyone only remembers what they have in their own lifetime, and they don't seem to realize that the codes and the signals that we use today were actually, most of them, invented over 2,000 years ago. All we've done is tickle them a bit with technology and make them into something more interesting. But the codes and the signals, if you want to know their history, I know as World War II guys, you're really enthusiastic about the Enigma, but perhaps not so when you realize the Enigma actually was invented in 1514. So when you start to look at that, you see why we have to go a little way back and realize where this stuff came from so we understand where we are today.
Exactly. And the point, you know, Ken and Terri and I discussed, had a meeting yesterday, and basically this first show is going to be a springboard to future shows that will tackle some particular specific subjects. We want to tackle Enigma and Ultra and pigeons and naval intelligence and signals intelligence and wirelesses and Y service and Y stations and all those things and radar and coding. But before we can get down and talk about that stuff, we've got to go back and talk about the basics. So tonight, a bit different from, we're actually using a PowerPoint presentation, and Ken and Terri will tell me when to bring the next slide up. So I'll get the first slide up. So I hope you enjoy this, folks, because I'm going to. So I'm going to hand over to Ken to start talking. When you need the next slide, Ken, just say next slide and I'll press the button. So we're going to start with this first slide. So all over to you, Ken.
Thank you. You have a message, and for more than 2,000 years, messages have been sent and received. Signals stay the same. It's the technology that changes. By seeing where we came from, we can see how we arrived here today.
So messages haven't changed. The language of the black chamber in the 16th century is actually still used. The German stormtroopers of 1918 used a code created in 200 BC. The code wheels in Enigma were first used in the 15th century.
Next slide, please. Hugh Patterson, he's a signaller from the 2nd Canadian Division on D-Day, June the 6th, 1944. You are going to smell burning equipment, the beachmaster told him. He was in charge of moving the troops off the invasion beach. He walked down the sand to Huey. You are going to smell death. Do not look left. Do not look right. Follow me.
So Hugh Patterson was from Caledonia in Ontario. He joined the Royal Corps of Signals, or Royal Canadian Corps of Signals, in June of 1942. On D-Day +2, Huey, who was a dispatch rider, splashed off a landing craft and pushed his motorbike up to the beach of Normandy, Juno Beach in particular. There were columns of rising smoke, the smell of oil, salt water, sounds of shouted orders, and the sounds of wounded men.
Next slide, please. Huey said, he told me, some of us did look. There were bloated animals, a great number of German soldier corpses. We went to a small village to find the 2nd Divisional Signals. We slept in slip trenches. That night we got mortared, and in the wheat field in front was littered with the corpses of German paratroopers.
So Huey was one of 24 dispatch riders who landed. They carried critical information like maps, orders, between units of the 2nd Canadian Division. So they rode motorcycles or they drove in jeeps, delivering messages to units who were close to the enemy. But Huey needed to know where the enemy was. How was he going to find them? Hitler had boasted that his panzer attack would drive the Allies back into the sea, but it was the 2nd day of the Normandy invasion, and they still didn't know where this invasion was going to come from.
Next slide, please. A dispatch is carried. The technology changes from Pheidippides, who carried the message about Marathon for the Greek victory, to the Anzacs in Gallipoli in 1916, to the German advance during the Blitzkrieg of 1939. Delivering a message can be broken down into the message, you keep the message safe, the method, protect the method of sending the message, and the moment. Deliver the message in a time to an organization that can use the information.
So messages are meaningless unless the organization can understand the message. They have the technology to make use of that information, and they have the power or the people to use that information.
A typical example of that was the Battle of Crete. The information brought by signals told them when the Germans were coming, how the Germans were coming, but there wasn't the power there to stop them. Next slide, please. Sending a message works in 4 types of communication. Visual signaling, which is 2,000 years ago. We have mechanical age in the 18th century, electromechanical age, that's the Enigmas type of stuff, the electric valves, and we have the digital age, which is where we are today with steganography.
So signaling is a journey in technology, so join us.
Next slide, please. 2,700 years ago in Sparta, a kingdom in Greece, they used the scutali, the batons of the same diameter, to pass secret orders and messages from the king to his generals. The king and the generals carried these scutali with the same diameter, and the king could wrap a leather strap around his scutali, write the message along the side of it, and that strip could then be used to carry the messages to his generals.
So in 404 BC, a bloody and wounded messenger arrived at the palace of the king Lysander of Sparta. He was the remaining messenger of 5, sent from a spy who was reporting that the king of Persia was planning on an attack. The message was carried on the belt of the messenger, and he was handed to the king. The king read the message of warning by wrapping the belt around his scutali.
And the scutali, a jumbling of the letters, now known as a transposition cipher. Next slide, please. We use the word transposition, meaning letters were transposed or rearranged, creating an anagram. An anagram is a word or phrase formed by rearranging the letters into a different word or phrase.
The tactical ciphers from these ancient times that were used in World War I and World War II date back to ancient times.
And they're still used today.
Yeah, just
Caesar
jump
shift.
in there. You when you speak, Terri, your audio is a bit quieter. I don't know whether it's because the microphone's a bit further away from you or something, but we can hear you, but it's a bit quieter.
Okay, sorry, I'll try and scream like I'm talking to my kids.
Yeah, that's better. That what you're doing now is perfect.
Well, let's have a look at Caesar shift. Initially, if you look at Caesar shift, you notice that what they've done is shift the alphabet along about 3 letters. So if you want to say an A, the cipher alphabet will be a D. Now, this is fairly simple, but this is the beginning of the Enigma.
So Julius Caesar would send ciphers to his officers. When we do talks, I usually ask the kids, so do you want to hear the real story or do you want to hear the really gross story? The really gross story is that Caesar wrote lovey-dovey letters to Cleopatra, but the truth is he was sending messages to his officers because some of the British tribes had learned to read and write Latin.
Right.
Polybius, he is the one, this one is very interesting because this was used all the way up to the Vietnam War. And this was first created in 200 BC, which is quite some time ago by a couple of Greeks. And Polybius himself, he used this to be able to send steganography and cryptography by fire and water. But I'll let Terri tell you about that.
Oh, so, are we flipping a page?
No.
No. Oh, so we're going to talk about the Greek Polybius. He developed a square in 200 BC that was used for fractionalizing plain or ordinary text to be represented by a smaller set of numbers, or that can be sent by telegraphy. Say that one 5 times fast. So stenography, such as knots in a string, or cryptography, as in a substitution cipher. And what's interesting is the substitution cipher was used by American prisoners in Vietnam, as well as by the SOE and SIS agents who parachuted into France and the Balkans in World War II. And both of the British and the Germans in 1939 were using a double Playfair adaptation.
So basically, the Polybius square is good because if you want to tap out a message on the side of a pipe or the side of a wall, instead of sending a letter B, you just tap out a 2 and a 1. And that's how the Polybius square works. That's why it's still used today. Next slide, please. Okay, we've been using a lot of jargon here, and I know the Army loves jargon, and in signaling we're very bad at that. We tend to use long words. So a quick familiarity tour. First of all, we're starting with creating a secret message, and we're starting about steganography. And the key to steganography is you cover the message and the message is hidden. So
steganos means covered, and graphene means to write. So together it means hidden writing.
Microdot.
Well, microdot. In World War II, the Germans they shrunk a page to the size of a dot, placed it in a letter, and that was revealed in 1941. Next is least significant bit insertion. Say that one. It's basically where the message is broken into bits and placed into the least significant bit in data. And in that, if the message is found, the secret is revealed.
That basically is what's going on these days with, if you see a picture which is sent to you on the internet, one of the things to do is to try and check how many pixels are in that picture. If there's more pixels than you would expect, the chances are you got an insertion of a least significant bit for sending a message. Cryptography.
Oh, so cryptos means hidden, and again, graphene means to write, so it's hidden writing.
And the main forms of hiding this message are in transposition and in substitution. Transposition means to arrange the letters to create an anagram.
So that's with the Spartan Scutali or with the Caesar shift.
With substitution, you substitute the words or the letters for different words and letters.
Or for different languages. So for example, Caesar wanted to send a message to Cicero. He was kind of trapped behind a siege. And what Caesar did was he wrote the message in Latin, or he changed it from Latin to Greek because he knew that the Germanic tribes couldn't understand that language. And so that is substitution.
And in that, we come to the ones which we're mainly interested in with the Second World War. That is code books and ciphers. With the code book, the main problem here is that you need a code book to create the code. The advantage of codes is you've got more than 26 words you can use to be able to create your message. But as with the U-boats found when they were in World War II, if the code books are discovered, then your code is broken. Ciphers, with the cipher, you need a key. And in 1883, what they looked at was a guy called Kirchhoff, who argued that with ciphers, you only need the key, you don't need the algorithm. And this is the basis of public key encryption that your bank uses when they put your credit card through. This is public key encryption, where the algorithm is not important, it's only the key. It's the basis today of modern security. If you want to know more about this, I read a book by Simon where I got this diagram from. Next slide, please.
So I'm just going to jump in for a second, just because so the things I'm learning, because I'm being the dumb audience now. The things I'm learning is the principles haven't changed. Is that where we are? That basically these forms of communication, these forms of sending messages, because you keep connecting the past with today, that really hasn't changed. So this is establishing this idea we had of this show being a foundation for future shows. It may be kind of the covering a lot in this show, but it's all essential to go into the depth we're going to hope to do in future shows. So that's so good. Yeah, I'll let you carry on. That's good. I'm good. Keep going. Brilliant.
Okay. Well, here's and this is the Alberti wheel, and this was corrected, and also the Vigenère cipher. The Alberti wheel was built in 1467, and the inner wheel with this could be taken out and changed. And I won't spoil what Terri wants to tell you, but as I said, it's a single alphabetic code, and the Vigenère code is known as a polyalphabetic, meaning many alphabets. But we'll get to that in a minute. What you have here is the basic code system, which was used right up till 1967.
Wow.
So Leon Alberti invented a polyalphabetic, which means more than one alphabet, cipher disk and cipher in 1467. It included numbers which could be mixed with phrases in a code book. And this was the basis of the Enigma electromechanical machine invented 500 years later. So basically you're just taking one of those Alberti wheels, putting a bunch of them together and adding in a few knobs and wires, and you're keeping it secret. Next is the Vigenère, which kind of annoys me because it really wasn't Blaise de Vigenère who invented it. It was somebody else, but he gets all the credit. Anyway, so it is a cipher of 26 alphabets like the Caesar cipher based on the letters of a keyword and a polyalphabetic substitution. So it was first invented in 1553, wrongly attributed to Blaise de Vigenère. And then for 300 years, the code wasn't broken until 1863, when a Prussian officer called Kozitzky published a decryption method. Now, Charles Babbage, he developed an analytical engine based on the fundamentals of the Vigenère cipher that became the first computer known as the Turing Complete. And in 1854, Babbage deciphered the Vigenère. However, Britain was at war with Russia in the Crimea, and the government said, no, don't publish the fact that you've broken the code, because we want you now to break the Russian Vigenère code.
And that happens time and time again. And as we get to the Enigma story, you'll see that story is repeated. And similarly, with the public cipher keys, you'll find that that story is repeated again and again. The ciphers don't change, just the way we use them. The Enigma had 3 or 4 rotors, so it had 3 or 4 Alberti wheels. The Lorenz, which we'll talk about in a few moments, had 12 rotors. But the Vigenère code had 26 alphabets. Next slide, please. With the black chambers, basically, this is the first time we have industrialized code breaking. Sadly, for Queen Elizabeth's cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, she didn't have the ability to get hold of a Legionnaire code. And as a result of that, and it's a long story, which if you want to know more, we can tell it later. But basically, she was having messages brought back and forth, but Phelps, who was the spy master with Queen Elizabeth, he basically took the code and created a false message to the conspirators, who then identified themselves. They were tortured, they were executed, and the rest of history. Next page, please. This is the routine from the Vienna Black Chamber. Basically, what happened was that the Black Chambers were brought about because of the wars in Europe and the city-states in Europe. And therefore, people paid a lot of money to be able to get the sort of, to get this, the type of, paid a lot of money to be able to get the information that kept their governments out of war. Again, I'll ask Terri to run through the 3 parts of a message which were attacked by the Black Chambers.
So the 3 parts were the message, which was copied and coded, the method, which was the intercepting the envelope, then sliding the seal, and then the moment, strict timetable. So you open the seal, then you reseal it, return it to the post office, and then you sell the information to a foreign agent. In 1774, a French embassy secretary paid 1,000 ducats and received 2 packages of information from Vienna regarding Louis XIV's Black Chamber in Paris.
So life hasn't changed. We talk about Russia and what Korea are doing, and it was already being done way back in the 18th century. Next slide, please. Telegraph stations. Now we're getting into the mechanical age in the 19th century. This is the age of Napoleon. This is the age of Channel battles. This is the age of Portugal and Spain. Claude Chappé had his telegraph system of moving arms right across France by 1796. That's the tower on the left-hand side of the screen looking at it.
Right.
Basically, what he was doing with that was being able to send messages across France. Britain wasn't too far behind with the Murray Admiralty telegraph system, which used sliding panels. That's the one on the right. But the nice thing about this is that this was the first time that ships at sea coming up the English Channel could actually communicate to London and to Portsmouth within 15 minutes of arriving in the Channel.
Wow.
And this is actually one of the, well, not one of the first times that Napoleon uses deception to get something to happen using false information. So in the Battle of Austerlitz, the French forces had seized Vienna in 1805. Napoleon sends his army after them, but then he thinks, well, maybe that's not such a good idea. And he thinks, how about I do this? He orders them to retreat, and they retreat back as far as Austerlitz. He then weakens his right flank deliberately. He sends some messages using his very own personal telegraph stations, and the Allies fall for it. They try to break through. He ends up encircling the Austrians and the Russians, and he ends up defeating them.
So using the telegraph in the battlefield was attributed to Napoleon, but we find that when we look at the battles of Portugal and Spain against Napoleon, Wellington by then was using the Gamble radiated telegraph to be able to communicate from Portugal to Spain. Next slide, please. This is where life at long last gets really interesting, where although the messages haven't changed and the messages don't change, but the technology and how we can communicate changes dramatically. This is the electric-mechanical age. It's the age of Morse code and the age of electricity.
So the Wheatstone and Fothergill electromagnetic telegraph was uses a magnetized needle on a letterboard that responds to pulses of electricity carried by cable. So in 1844, Prince Alfred was born to Queen Victoria, and news of that was telegraphed from Windsor to the Times newspaper by this newfangled technology.
That brings us to Morse code. John Vail and Samuel Morse developed the electromagnet to send dots and dashes onto paper. The dots and dashes represented letters of the alphabet. By 1851, there was a European form of Morse code that is now accepted as the International Morse Code.
So telegraph cables carried Morse code messages across the world. And in 1858, Queen Victoria sent a message on the transatlantic telegraph cable to the American president.
And all this was just in time for the Crimean War. Next slide, please. The telegraph cable carried messages around the world. Delivering the messages onto the battlefield was still by visual signaling, that is, flags.
Yep.
Henry Mance, however, in 1869, developed the signaling mirror into the heliograph. This was a massive advance. The heliograph was still used by the British Army in combat in 1941, and it was last used in conflict by the Pakistani Army in 1967. It uses a mirror with an oscillating mirror to reflect sunlight in short and long flashes to send Morse code.
So in the South African War, telegraph and heliograph messages could now be sent from London to Johannesburg in 4 days. And Lord Dundonald, General Officer Commanding of the Canadian Militia, was so impressed with heliograph, he said, "I would like to see heliographs brought into use to enable me to signal my forces at a distance. And I believe there should be established schools of instruction in signaling." So that was Lord Dundonald. And by special order in General Order 167, the Canadian Signaling Corps Militia was established in, the date's really important, October 24th, 1903. This was the first Canadian organization that had signaling in the British Empire. And then in Britain, the Corps of Signal was formed on 28 June 1920. So Canadians were kind of ahead of the game there.
I see you wanted to make that point there. Okay, fine. Yeah.
Maybe just a little.
That's fine. One-upmanship is fine.
Let's get on to the industrial side and
Sorry.
World War I. This is where it gets interesting. The next slide, please. In World War I, France and Germany had standing armies prepared for a European war. Britain only had a small colonial army for quick policing actions like the Boer War. But it was supported by a powerful navy. Visual signaling sent by Morse code using heliograph, signals flags, and lights, with messages sent by pigeons, runners, and dogs, and telegraph connecting the headquarters and telephone lines brought this new technology into the trenches.
So Morris Wright, who was a Marconi engineer in 1912, he was working in Chelmsford and he was doing some intercept when he suddenly realized that he could listen to the German Navy. So he got those intercepts to Reginald Blinker Hall, and Reginald Blinker Hall was pretty smart. So he had Morris develop a chain of intercept stations, and he created a secret listening station in Norway. So the Battle of Dogger Bank allowed the British to win because this long wave station had intercepted what the Germans were planning on doing.
Next slide, please.
So I'm just going to ask a question now, because because I am, because it's my show. So I'm just checking. If we go back to the Caesar era, it seems to me as what you're explaining is the gap between, if you like, the goodies having the technology and the baddies having the technology is narrowing as the years passed. In the early days, the Romans had an advantage over other people. As it gets closer to World War I, everybody's getting a much more similar technology, so that the gaps between the technologies are reducing. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. There's another little sneaky part that goes in with this, is that the industrialized nations now have clued in to signals warfare. The Brits commanding the seas could rip up the telegraph cables. That's impeding what the Germans can do. But the Germans can advance very quickly because they've got a big army. But the French are pretty clued in too as well. And they start ripping up all the telephone wires and the telegraph cables. So the Germans, again, are forced to use radio. But that's, as we develop this story, you can see how Bletchley Park starts to be, has a mission of importance. And the Germans have their initiatives reduced by the Allies taking away means of communication and guiding the Germans to using communication that they know they can monitor.
Right, okay.
So in the industrial law, both sides intercept the messages, and credit where credit's due, the Germans were really very good at this, and we Brits were not ever so good at the moment. But let's tell you about the Battle of the Somme, and you'll see what I mean.
So on the Somme, an attack was expected due to British bombardment. And on the 1st of July, 1914, German intercept picked up a message from a British officer offering encouragement to the forward troops waiting to advance. And then on 23rd of July, the British staff issues a memo that there was clear evidence that a German system of overhearing was being used extensively, and that it must be assumed that the enemy has listening apparatus. Sorry, it was kind of because you were telling them. Oh, sorry. And then in July, Auvilliers-la-Boisselle was attacked and captured from the Germans, and a complete copy of the battle orders of the Corps was found.
Pictures that you can see on the screen in front, they show some of the devices that were used for the interception. The telegraph wires radiate, and as these radiate, by putting 2 copper wires into the ground, you pick up those radiations, because on the British equipment in particular, and on the German equipment, the equipment was earthed by putting pins into the ground. And of course, a lot of the communication electricity went through the ground and was being picked up by the enemy. The system that you can see on the right of the German listening station in France, that equipment is called a Moritz. And these operators were in the front trenches, and they were experts in Glaswegian and Welsh and Aussie speak, and also experts in French, so they can understand the language that was being spoken. Once this equipment got seized or got captured, both the French and the British copied it, and the British system was called ITOC, and they had a range of about 500 yards. Next slide, please. After this, what we found that the Hague put out an order in October 1914 after the Somme, with casualties like you can't imagine. And it was the order on the indiscreet use of telephone. And it was to end unnecessary gossip. And it introduced silence, and it warned of severe punishment if anyone was caught. And ITOC was deployed not against the Germans, but against the British themselves to stop their chatter. You can see 3 means of visual communications that were brought in again. On the farthest left is the heliograph. In the center is the shutterboard, because the sun doesn't shine all the time. And on the right are the lamps themselves that they were using. And these 3 instruments were, again, you'll see them again when we go to war in the Second World War.
So Major General Nadler said, quote, "Step by step, the countermeasures were tightened, but the main obstacle throughout the process was the frequent disregard by the telephone users of the orders relating to forbidden subjects. The worst offenders often being the more senior officers who had the most to give away. It is no exaggeration to say that thousands of casualties resulted from these indiscretions during the course of 1915 and 1916. And it was not until 1917 that the countermeasures became reasonably effective."
Next slide, please. This is one of the main achievements of signals in the First World War because it brought America into the war. In January 1917, Zimmerman, who was the foreign minister in Germany, sent a secret diplomatic telegram from the German Foreign Office proposing an alliance between Germany and Mexico. Germany would provide the arms and support to Mexico as they recovered Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and if they would persuade Japan to invade the United States. The message was intercepted by British intelligence and given to the Americans. Zimmerman admitted it was true, and the United States declared war on Germany. Paul, do you have time just to hear a little more about this?
Sure, let's go down a little bit. Yeah, sure.
Okay.
So Germany was permitted to use the American cable by President Woodrow Wilson as a peace initiative since the British had torn up all their cables at the beginning of the war. Now, the British had to ensure that the Americans didn't realize that Room 40 had intercepted the telegram with their cable, nor should the Germans know that Room 40 could break their cipher. So Nigel de Grey was the gentleman who decoded the had been pulled out of Antwerp just before it was captured by the German, and he was in the Naval Brigade. He used old German diplomatic code books from Mesopotamia, and the German ship, the Magdeburg. Now, the German ambassador in Washington had sent a coded message through the Mexican Commercial Telegraph Office in an old code. A British agent in Mexico bribed the employee in the telegraph office and obtained a copy of the message. And as it was an older code, if the British revealed that the message, well, it was okay. It was an old code and they really didn't care. The message was handed to an American ambassador by the British foreign minister in London, and on February 1st, Germany began unrestricted U-boat war, sinking 2 American ships. And so that, in addition to the Zimmerman Code, was instrumental in the Americans declaring war on April 6, 1917, on Germany.
Next slide, please. These were the technology changes which came about from the First World War. And you see we have a significant emphasis on radio. The electronic interception of messages, the direction finding, the fuller phones, so now phones could be used, the tactical ciphers, which we'll come to, Playfair and AFBX, ground-to-air communications, which were done in Ypres. Radio is now far more effective, and signals intelligence actually was part of planning, particularly in the 100 Days campaign, which invaded Germany. Next slide, please. Sorry. Stormtroopers. In 1918, with the collapse of Russia, German troops were now available for a new offensive. In June 1918, the German army is 100 miles away from Paris. The French had a crypto unit and 6 direction finding stations. The rapid German advance, but the French cut the telegraph wires. The Germans had to use radio. And the AFGVX code was being intercepted by George Parvin of the intercept unit. And with 24 hours, he was able to break it and read the message that rush munitions even by day if not seen. This was identified to a unit only 80 miles from Paris. Within a week, the French had reinforced that unit, and when the Germans attacked, they failed and the Germans were pushed back from Paris.
So in 1918, the war became mobile. The telephone wire could not be laid quickly enough. Tactical signaling by then was by flags and lamps, but the radio really came into its own with new codes for tactical moves. Reconnaissance was done in motorcycles with radio in the sidecar. Rapid German attacks by stormtroopers with radio. Now, what's interesting, if we go back to our friend the Polybius Square in 200 BC, it was kind of morphed into something a little different. So in 1918, Lieutenant Fritz Nebel developed it into that, what Ken was talking about, the AFDGX Polybius Square.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a 5x5 code, and it was in a cipher grid square. It was a two-phase substitution and transposition. So you would choose the letters that sound very different in Morse code. And really kind of interesting was the British and the Allies used a Polybius square for associating numbers with letters in a tactical level code known as Playfair. It was invented by Charles Wheatstone in 1854 and named after his sponsor, Lord Playfair. But as we know, both the British and the Germans were using a version of Playfair and sometimes doubling up the Playfair.
Yeah, basically this is it. There was a need to get a tactical code. The telegraph codes could be handled at the higher headquarters, but for the units in the field, you had to have a tactical code because of the listening devices used in the trenches on both sides. Mm. Next slide, please. Between the wars, and despite our delivered history, this is a very exciting time. In 1925, the German military had an inquiry into suspicions that their codes were being broken in World War I. Go ahead.
So that comes from in 1918, the British Army committed to radio interception. In 1920, we have the Official Secrets Act, where cable companies must hand copies of all their cables passing through the UK within 10 days of being received. And then Churchill comes along and he publishes The World Crisis, where he writes, how should we say this, a little more dramatically than what history was. And he writes about the Magdeburg Code book seizure. And then in 1923, the Royal Navy publishes an official history saying interception and cryptanalysis was a clear advantage. Hi, guess what we've been doing? We've been breaking your information.
Okay.
So Admiral Dönitz was a U-boat commander who was sunk and captured by the British. He read both books, and then that inquiry was set up in 1925.
And all levels of the military and the government purchased in total 30,000 Enigma machines as World War II developed. In 1925, Sibelius was producing Enigma, and also they were introduced into the military service by 1926. By 1934, Japanese ciphers were being used by the naval attaché, had been broken by Bletchley. By 1937, the Italian Enigma was being read on a regular basis. And by 1939, Dilly Knox and Alan Turing were reading their first Nazi Enigma message. This is between the wars. Next slide, please. So what is Enigma? Basically, it's an electromechanical Alberti wheel. It has wires and a keyboard with inputs from electrics. They go through and back through a scrambling unit and then are displayed as ciphertext on an electric light display. It's later, there was more rotors were applied to it and a plug board was added so you could limit the number of letters coming out. The main thing about this, though, is it's offline. To operate this machine, it isn't a one-man operation. You need one person to operate the HF radio, you need another to operate the machine, and you need a third one to write down the message. It's labor intensive. The message was sent or received using Morse code and sent over high frequency radio, which basically could be intercepted by any unit with a radio. It was used in U-boats, battleships, trawlers, the railways, command units, in the field, in the Luftwaffe. The key to Germany's blitzkrieg was Enigma and its coordination for speed of attack through communication.
Well, isn't that interesting? In 1918, Arthur Scherbius and Ritter had invented an Enigma mechanical cipher machine, but no one wanted it. In 1919, Alexander Cook invented one in the Netherlands. No one wanted it. In 1920, Erud Dam in Sweden invented one. They didn't want it. In 1920, Edward Hebern in America built one, called it his Sphinx of the Wireless. And Henry Stinson, Secretary of State for the United States, said, "Gentlemen should not read each other's mail." Now, the really interesting thing was that Room 40 cryptanalysis carried on between the wars. And that's why they were able to read the Enigma codes. But in 1926, the Poles were finding Herman messages that they couldn't break. The Poles couldn't relax because they had an idea that was coming. So they formed a new cipher bureau. And Captain Ziesky located a commercial Enigma, and then the work began. Hans Thilo Schmidt was a spy for the French in 1931. He had information passed on to the Polish. In June 1939, liaison began between the British, the French, and the Polish codebreakers. And then, as we know, in September 1939, Germany invaded Poland.
Next slide, please. In the field for the soldiers, we were back to visual signaling, and a flag could go 7 miles at 7 to 10 words per minute. A lamp could reach 20 miles at 4 to 10 words per minute. The heliograph, the long range communication, could do 30 miles at 5 to 16 words per minute. And then the Canadian Army, when they went over, took 20,000 pigeons with them. And also we had radio.
So in the 1930s, wireless technology created an explosion of transmissions. Now the Germans needed a quick and effective cipher system, so there needed to be a balance between the speed of the message and the need to keep it secret. So the German tactical encryption field units used a double playfair, which we spoke about earlier, that the British had used in World War I and that they had kept using in between the wars.
Next slide, please. With the Enigma and with the overlay photographs you can see there, basically in 1939, the declaration of war against Germany, a British telegraph ship, same as like in the First World War, sailed out and cut the undersea telegraph cables from Germany. Bletchley Park had been set up, new and old code breakers were brought back in and recruited to apply academic research discipline to cryptanalysis. And this is a fundamental difference between the way cryptanalysis was handled in the UK and how it was handled by the ABFA in Berlin.
So radio was essential for the Blitzkrieg, and Enigma was essential for passing orders to high command. Now, as French and British troops pulled back, the telegraph telephone networks were cut, so that ensured that the Germans had to use radio, which again was something that the Allies could intercept. they encouraged the Germans to rely on radio. Now, Dr. Jones, who was a British scientific intelligence officer, said, quote, "There has never been anything comparable in any other period of history to the impact of radio. You probe the deployments, the intentions of the enemy without spies or frigates. Now the radio wars had begun."
Next slide, please. WWII stations, the listening stations. This is where the majority of information came from. The radio enabled armies to discover deployments without spies or reconnaissance. The spies and the reconnaissance were now the WWII stations. The Bedienst in Germany, Rommel in Africa, Bletchley Park in the UK, WWII stations listened and wrote down the messages.
So, for example, on D-Day in 1944, Eva Etfler was listening in a deep bunker under the central square in Caen in Normandy. Now, Eva was a Luftwaffe operated recording unit transmissions, and she said towards midnight it changed. There was a sense of urgency. Everything erupted, and she went into the control room. She said it was incredible. A huge map of the channel on the wall was pinned with little markers and colored flags, hundreds of them, parachutists in the heart of Normandy.
And across the channel, there was Elizabeth Taylor, who was in Dover Castle.
She said there was panic. We could hear it. The messages were panicking. They stopped sending Morse in cipher. It was just plain German, very rapid, not waiting, just sending, not waiting for an acknowledgement, just sending.
Okay, next slide, please. Coupled with those listening to the messages were the direction finding, and this is how the submarines and the aircraft were found.
So these were usually short coded messages preceded by BBB, and then a short message in a 4-letter code, rather less important than
Then taking the bearings.
Yeah, that's it. So we would stick up an arm and we would scribble the message down and yell out the frequency, and the supervisor would come over immediately and he would pass it on to the direction finders. Now, what's really cool about the direction finders is Dönitz told his U-boat commanders that they could send messages as long as they were less than 30 seconds. The direction finders in the British Channel were intercepting those messages, locating them in 6 seconds.
Wow.
I spoke to Elizabeth Taylor about how she did this, and she said that basically the U-boat surfaced on the hour, once an hour. Most of the hour was taken up by automatic repeats from the German control of old messages. And then 5 minutes to the hour, there was silence. And it was in that silence that the U-boats would surface and transmit to their control. Next slide, please. SIGINT, Signals Intelligence, the X stations. The German Bedienst broke some of the Allied codes. They broke the US State Department code, the Polish and French free codes, the RAF 4-character cipher, US M209 cipher. During the Battle of the Atlantic, the Bedienst broke the convoy codes right up until late 1944. They knew where the convoys were. The British 8th Army suffered badly when fighting Rommel until it was realized that an Italian spy had copied the British code and given it to the American ambassador that had been given to the American ambassador in Tripoli. Bletchley, its code-breaking achievements. In 1941 to 42, the Battle of Crete, North Africa, Malaya, they knew the enemy plans. 1942 to 1945, the jamming of the navigational beams and the radar beams, the beam benders. There are some very dramatic stories regarding the action of beam benders. 1942 to 1944, locating the U-boats and the wolf packs. 1942, North Africa and El Alamein, deception of the German forces. 1943 to 1944, Operation Zen, creating a fictional army in Egypt to keep 22 enemy divisions away from D-Day and in Yugoslavia and Greece.
So Helen Curry was an ATS Lance Corporal working on the Tunnies at Bletchley Park. She said, "The traffic became almost more than we could cope with. My assignment was German Army traffic. We pushed the buttons and then typing the code, and only when clear German appeared could one breathe a sigh of relief. We typed to the end of the German message, then placed it in the outbasket."
Next slide, please. Oh. Enigma and the Bombe. Sorry, we got something our end again. I apologize. This is machine versus machine. In the previous war, the First World War, it was pen and pad, but now it was machine versus machine. The bomb replicated the cipher wheels using the Enigma machine to break the code with varying success.
So Lywood and Smith in the Air Ministry developed the TypeX from an Enigma the Air Ministry had borrowed in 1934. And the TypeX cipher was not broken by the Germans. And as a matter of fact, the Germans had captured several examples of the TypeX device during the chaotic British retreat to Dunkirk in 1940. The German Signal Service recognized that it was a close copy of its own Enigma, and in fact, it was a blatant infringement. And as such, it also enjoyed most of the high security qualities. Now, accordingly, the German Signal Service deployed only a handful of personnel to the task of studying the TypeX intercept. And it was their mistaken belief that any prolonged examination of Allied strategic signals would be a complete waste of their time.
Next slide, please. When there's a map at the back of the slide which shows the SZ40 hubs that existed in Germany. And it's interesting to note that most of the hubs, when the Russians advanced, were in the Russian sector. So this also is maybe a clue to what happened after the war as we get towards the end of our presentation. Say again?
Well, I just went, don't worry, keep going.
In 1941, the Germans sent high command messages on a Lorenz and a Siemens teleprinter network. That's the machine on the bottom left of the slide. In August 1941, Colonel Tillman was able to break the first message. And by 1942, Bill Tutt, who came out to Canada later, by listening just to the noises the code made, was able to build a theoretical model of the Lorenz cipher. And he, with a telephone engineer called Tommy Flowers, were able to create the first computer known as Collosus. And it was operational on the 1st of June, 1944. And I can hear you thinking, just in time.
Yeah.
So Tommy Flowers wrote, quote, "On the 5th of June, Eisenhower was in a conference when a courier arrived from Bletchley Park. Hitler had sent Field Marshal Rommel battle orders by radio transmission, which Bletchley Park had decoded with the aid of the new Colossus. Hitler had told Rommel that the invasion of Normandy was imminent, but that this would not be the real invasion. It was a feint to draw troops away from the Channel ports against which the real invasion would be launched. Rommel was not to move any troops. He was to wait for the real invasion, which could be expected 5 days after the Normandy landing. Eisenhower just handed the paper back to the courier and said, 'We go tomorrow.' That was on 6th.
Next slide, please. Now, this is a work of art. It is the most incredible coordinated and controlled signals battle plan I've seen. It is Operation Bodyguard. The intent was to add to real threats a mix of false threats. Its target was Hitler and his command staff. Nobody else, Hitler and his command staff. The aim of Bodyguard was to deceive the enemy to the time, the size, and the location of the invasion. The main battles were Fortitude North, and this was creating a threat to Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, and thence into Germany. Grafham was an operation to persuade Sweden to support Fortitude North, and it was so successful that the Swedes reduced their diplomatic connections with the UK because they said it was undue pressure. Zeppelin, we've heard about down in the south with the Balkans. Ferdinand, landings in Mediterranean and Italy. Royal Flush, diplomatic moves again with Spain, Turkey, and Sweden to bring them alongside. Okay.
As D-Day got closer, telephone exchanges and telephone wires used by the Nazis were destroyed. So more and more of their communications were being sent by high-frequency radio. And Bletchley Park collated these signals both from the Lorenz teleprinter and Enigma. The intelligence was coordinated at the highest level using all resources from diplomacy to deceit. So Fortitude South was the threat to land in the Pas-de-Calais.
I'll just add Fortitude South because this, basically, they destroyed all the radar systems that the Germans were using to look at the UK, except for those in the Pas-de-Calais. And then using destroyer flotilla, including such ships as the Athabascan and Haida from Canada. They sailed down the coast from Glasgow. And as they sailed down, a flight of Lancasters from the Dambuster Squadron flew over the top. They were dropping a thing called Glimmer, which was strips of tin foil, and also towing rafts, which are repeating the signal of the radar stations, causing total chaos to the Freiburg system, which was in Calais. These are just some of the signals battles which are carrying on during D-Day, on a glorious day. The progress of the deception plan was checked by Hitler's messages on the Lorenz and by the double-cross spy system that was set up by the control units over D-Day. Messages from the Japanese Purple Cipher were also intercepted from their ambassador in Berlin, and they confirmed what the German plans were. Any questions about that before?
No, we're good. We're good.
Okay, next slide, please. After the war, Enigma, The Bombe, Lorenz, Collosus. At the end of the war, Britain captured thousands of Enigma machines and distributed them to former colonies and other agencies who believed them to be secure. The Soviet armies had captured the majority of the Lorenz SZ-40 teleprinter hubs. It was likely Enigma and Lorenz would continue to be used. Bletchley Park closed. The staff, including the Soviet spies Cairncross and Philby, were sworn to secrecy. Computers and bombs were seen to be destroyed, records burned, but the government communications headquarters continued.
So from 1945 onward, the German border police continued to use Enigma to track war criminals as part of the German Federal Ministry of the Interior. And they were used to encipher names and birth dates until 1974, when Winterbottom's book revealed how the Enigma had been broken by the British.
So finally, Paul, technology continues to change. The message, the method, and the moment stay the same.
Well, cool. Well, that was the end of the presentation. So for those watching, folks, the idea was, as we've accomplished, to set out the very basics, although it was very detailed as well, over the course of history. And then, as I said earlier in the show, we can springboard to more in-depth shows with the same guests and other guests. We're going to talk about Enigma. David O'Keefe is going to come on and talk about the Dieppe raid and Enigma. We can talk about the Y station, bring other people involved as well. So, but from the time being, then we're going to leave it at that. So, just the only question I had really is Well, it's not a question because I understand it from the presentation, but basically I thought Enigma was new, but I didn't realize until tonight that Enigma was based on something 500, is it 500 years earlier, 600 years earlier? But a long time anyway. I hadn't realized that the principles hadn't changed.
The nice thing about the Alberti wheel is that the wheels that fitted onto the Alberti wheel in 1514 were in fact interchangeable, and you could put different combinations of wheels. So you could use it either as a cipher code book, or you could use it as a monoalphabetic cipher wheel. Brilliant guy.
Yeah, amazing. So, well, I think that's good. We've done a bit more than an hour, so that was great. So, thank you very much. I've certainly learned a lot about Signals. There's some couple of comments. I don't think there's many questions today. People are just finding it very interesting, so that's very good. In terms of for World War II TV, bit of housekeeping, I just scheduled a brand new show Monday evening. We've got Dr. Philip Weir coming on to talk about the little ships at Dunkirk and blow some myths out of the water about that. And then, of course, next Friday, a show I'm really looking forward to. We're going to talk about the humorist, writer, satirist, cartoonist, poet Spike Milligan with some incredible guests, including his daughter Jane and Peter Gaddick Adams, and hopefully the comedian Stuart Lee. And of course, lockdown just began for us it hasn't quite begun yet, midnight tonight. So in a few hours' time, lockdown begins for us in France. So our plans to bring you some more live streamings from the battlefields have been put on hold, at least for time being. We'll plan things in the future, but it won't stop us doing the interviews. It won't stop us doing the panel discussions, and it won't stop us doing broadcasts from other places. There's some shows we've got coming up, thinking about from Poland and England and what have you. But from Normandy, we can't do any more live streamings for a month. So anyway, thank you very much, Ken. Thank you very much, Terri. Did you enjoy it? It wasn't too nervy, was it? It was all right. It was good.
It was awesome.
Despite the communications issue at the beginning, but that's just a good joke because it's a Signal show. So thank you very much for watching, everybody. Don't forget, check us out on Patreon. Check out the Vintage Signals team, their Facebook page. And as I said, we'll springboard from this and we'll go and talk about some more in-depth aspects of Signals. There's lots of things we want to talk about. And I want to do a show about just pigeons because I think that'll be cool. So thank you very much, Ken. Thank you very much, Terri. I'll see you all again on World War II TV very shortly. Thank you very much. Good evening. Bye.